Welcome back to Inclusive Design 2020, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum sponsors, Barclays Access and Adobe. You can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf. And if you have questions for the presenters, tweet them using the ID24 hashtag so that we can ask them at the end of the session. Just a quick reminder again that ID24 is a respectful community. You can find our code of contact on the website, which is inclusivedesign24.org. Next, we have Josh O'Connor, who's going to talk about XR accessibility. Over to you, Josh.
Hey, Hans, thank you very much. And hello, everybody. And I'm really glad to be here to be able to talk to you about some of my work in XR and accessibility. Very excited to be here. Thanks very much to everyone in ID24 for asking me to present and also for being so helpful, super helpful in going through the whole process. So wherever you are in the world, I hope everyone is well. The challenging times, and we're all facing times of change, and that's interesting from a technological perspective too when we talk about XOR. So my presentation today is going to be talking about accessibility in the context of XOR. I would generally use the term XOR. I don't particularly like the term virtual reality. I don't think it's particularly accurate. We're essentially talking about geospatial computing, and that's pretty much a kind of a buzz term. So I think XOR is reasonably good acronym for immersive environments. It's what I like to think of, the more augmented environments. So how will this work for people with disabilities? What's possible? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about some of the challenges around XOR. We're going to talk about some of the exciting opportunities, some of the technical issues, and I'm really happy to take you through this. So first of all, a little bit about me. I've been doing accessibility for quite a while. I'm based here in Ireland, and I've been 20 years or so working in the area of people with disabilities, and consider myself really fortunate to do so. I was just really happy to have a job where I was able to, probably maybe do more net good than harm, and not in any particularly egotistical sense, but just in a sense of surviving in the world, the world of sell, buy, values of shares may fall as well as rise was never particularly appealing to me. So I was really fortunate to be able to carve out a living working with people with disabilities. And I guess for some background, my background, even though I've been active in standards for years, as of many people involved with Inclusive Design 24, really my background is a grassroots practitioner. I was working with people with disabilities who, were trying to send email to their friends or trying to type letters. I'd come from a graphic design background before that, and I ended up working with people with disabilities just through a life curveball change. I needed a job quick as well, and I found a job working as an IT trainer, working directly with people with disabilities. And I had just actually finished a teaching qualification as well, which was at the time interesting because I was teaching. I learned how to teach in a simple way, like even how to, it didn't seem glamorous at the time, but how to teach someone to use Word, how to do lesson plans, how to do very simple stuff. And all that stuff actually turned out to be super useful when I started working with people with disabilities. And they, my clients at the time, they all had, hardcore physical disabilities and issues using computers. So they would use switches, various different kinds of input devices, Penny and Giles joysticks, combination of switches, scanning applications. And it was a real eye opener for me personally about the positive impact of technology, particularly at a time when I am now a tech skeptic. And I suppose in some degrees I always have been. I'm not particularly a fan of what we would call push technologies. I don't think they're socially very good. But I have seen technology do so much for people with disabilities, and I really, really want to support that. And then that feeds into much of my work running. I guess I ran a usability lab for about 10 years in the National Council for the Blind of Ireland, and we did user testing, usability testing. Don't send me email for calling it user testing, please, but usability testing with people with disabilities, and joining the dots for designers and developers who are looking for a steer on how to make their stuff accessible, and having that impact of a designer and developer meeting someone with a disability and interacting with them and talking to them and taking them through, how they use their assistive technologies or what they need in a UI. All of that has a massively powerful impact. So I guess the Whistle Stop Tour is, yes, I was ex-co-chair of WCAG, where we led the work on 2.1 with my co-chair Andrew Kirkpatrick from Adobe. I did that for about 5 years, and now I'm working with W3C as an emerging technology specialist with particular focus on accessibility. So again, just to recap before we move on, I'm personally really interested in the humane aspects of technology. Technology that can be used to support people. I'm also a believer in sufficient technology. That's as I said earlier, I don't like the culture of push technology and its potential social impact, and I guess you could say the greed behind some of these things. But we have, for example, time of great promise where people who have, limited access to education or limited access to economic opportunity through the use of technology can raise themselves up and make better lives. And I guess to be frank, in my own life, that I'm also one of those people too. So I had to work hard and study and all of those things. And, technology has enabled me even to have a better life also. So why can't we do that for everybody, regardless of their level of ability or so on and so forth? Okay, so practical grassroots experience making stuff work for a lot of different users. That's really what it's all about. Okay, so while I'm going to be giving this presentation, I'm going to be talking about we, and we means primarily the Research Questions Task Force in the Accessible Platform Architectures Working Group at W3C. So the Accessible Platform Architectures Group, or the APA, is a group in W3C which is responsible really for helping other working groups at W3C produce accessible specifications. And we do review of different specifications. We give feedback on different specifications, whether it's, CSS or whether it's HTML or whatever the spec is. It could be something to do with, media synchronization. It could be something to do with captioning. Whatever the work is, we try and contribute to any specification that covers or relates to accessibility. And also, people who are working on different specs at W3C may not actually realize that their spec has an accessibility implication also. So it can be a useful work to try and spot those points. So in the Research Questions Task Force, what we do is run by Jason White also and Scott Hollier, just to say, my colleagues there. We are looking at various different research questions relating to emerging technologies, and this is where we are incubating a lot of the work on XOR. So when I'm talking about we, that's what I mean. Okay, so as a platform, just for context, XOR is becoming more stable, and it's interesting while we were doing this work because it's been very hard, I think, to pick or to find a time when something like XOR hits a tipping point and becomes much more commonplace and stable. And there have been different times in the past when that was supposed to have happened and it hadn't really happened, I suppose. And it's rather synchronous that while we were starting to look at this work, there seems to be much more of a move towards XOR. And also, I think because of the current situation in the global situation with the pandemic, I think the use of XOR could become much more commonplace for work, for play, for many, many other things. So I think one of the reasons for that, if we look at why has that happened, potentially the fact that hardware is more ubiquitous. I mean, that was one of the things I think for a long time. It was maybe only some elite who could afford some particular bespoke technology, some very expensive thing that they need to have to be able to run all the stuff that they need to make this stuff work. That's becoming much more ubiquitous. So the cost to entry is probably less now than it ever was. And potentially this is good for people with disabilities who there's also the economic aspect of for many people with disabilities, they maybe often have limited income and can't afford to pony up for expensive hardware and all the rest of it, whether they want to or not, but just to have the option. It may not just be there. So these things need to be, I guess, accessible with a small a also. So my point is just about the fact that quite sophisticated hardware is now available to many, many people for relatively low cost. And I think that has some impact on the potential uptake of these things. Okay, so let's set the scene a little bit about what we're going to be talking about over the next few minutes. First of all, just a brief comment. I guess one of the interesting things about XOR, what I've experienced is I think the whole topic of XOR seems to tip into existential type discussions, potentially about the nature of reality, potentially about the nature of consciousness. All of these kind of things seem to hover around this whole topic. Personally, I find that stuff quite interesting, but it also brings up other things. It brings up things about the context of use. It brings up things about equality for people with disabilities. There's also issues around cognitive bias within machines. How that could potentially impact people who are potentially vulnerable. All of these things. It brings up a lot of very, very interesting issues. Some of that I'm not sure why. I wonder if it's partially people are naturally cautious about these new technologies and there's a fear of loss of control of them. And I understand that. But I try and focus on the good within it rather than some kind of dystopian aspects of it. My own personal feelings about it are a little ambivalent. I wonder particularly its impact on children, cognitive development, all of those kind of things. Sometimes it seems to be the richer the media, the richer the experience, the less they say maybe a child's imagination is used or a child's imagination kicks in, these kind of things. And then there's also a tendency to be fascinated with the device itself. This is something that I think is also kind of interesting. Rather than what the tool is to be used for, there's a fascination with the tool itself. So there's an interesting social context about the use of these things. It's a little bit also, for some other context, of there's a little bit of tomorrow everything will be okay, and that's why I think a certain degree of caution with these technologies or a certain degree of skepticism is actually a good thing. Having said that, there's a fantastic opportunity here, and as a technological platform, there's an opportunity to provide very, very rich experiences to augment the ability of a person in a way which enables them to do something they just could not do even on a traditional website or whatnot, to have experiences and senses of connection and senses of connection with their own selves in a way too, in a way which is diverse and enriching, enlivening, potentially good for their education, their economic prospects. So really accessibility is about equality also and alternatives. So one of the things that we find interesting and challenging about that is to make sure that that happens within the context of XOR. So is equality loading? We're not there yet, but hopefully these things will come together. Okay. So what will the user be able to do? So what will they use XOR for? So some exciting aspects of this, for example, is to be able to navigate a building that you could visit, you want to go to to be able to navigate that place in an XOR environment, be able to have a very clear mental map, a mental model of the environment, of the space, of the aspects of the building. For example, can you get to the restaurant, or the toilets accessible? Even all of these kind of things are very, very practical and very, very important. And XOR can make all that stuff happen too. There can be different modes as well within XOR, which is something that's potentially very, very exciting. In accessibility in the 2D space, we talk about a sighted user can see this, a non-sighted user needs some kind of alternative. Someone using a keyboard or some kind of augmented assistive technology device, or needs to be able to consume content in different ways. So to be able to do that in XOR, and to be able to as I say, navigate a building, do practical things in a mode that suits the way you work, is incredibly exciting. So that's something that's also very, very practical. Wayfinding, I think, in XOR is also something that could be very, very useful. I mentioned the practical things of being able to visit a building, but being able to, experiencing outdoors as well, outdoors environments and places in 360 environments is very, very, very helpful. Being able to find things like even the gradient level of paths, find accessible entrances, exits. Those kind of things are very, very useful, very, very helpful, as well as having an immersive experience within an environment which is potentially beautiful as well. XOR has great capacity and capability in terms of potentially new ways of interacting. And we are always, we hear of the new, something is new, but we're not always sure what that new is. We're not always sure how that will be. But we've potential possibility to dream up new ways of doing things, new ways of interacting. This also does present interesting challenges, which we'll get to more of, but for example, the implications of XOR on media, how people will consume media in XOR. Well, there will be a need for a whole load of accessibility requirements around that, and that's something that's potentially very interesting, something that we're also looking at in W3C. So how will our interactions change? Some of the interesting things, I had a personally very embarrassing experience in XOR. Actually, one of Thomas Logan's XOR accessibility or conference things, we were doing a thing in Mozilla Hub, and I was wandering around, and there was a presentation going on, and I got stuck in a lake. There's this lake thing, and I couldn't get back into the building where the presentation was going on, and it was really weird because I couldn't figure out how to get back into the building. And then I got a bit paranoid because I thought people were kind of looking at me. When I say me, my little avatar thing, I think I was a panda or some such thing. And I was stuck on the side on the lake outside this building, looking at the presentation. Indra Knight was giving a presentation in there from Helen Hamlin College, Helen Hamlin Center. She was giving a presentation there, and I was trying to watch it while I was floating on the lake. I couldn't figure out how to get in, and the social awkwardness of it was very interesting. And that's something just on a kind of a lower level of I certainly would need to figure out a bit more in XOR, the context of social cues. How do you interact with people you don't know in these kind of environments? There's a sense of social awkwardness, certainly, that I experience and feel, and I'm sure everybody else does to some degree. And what's really exciting is that, like, I noticed, for example, Thomas and his crew were very fluent in being able to interact in the environment and being able to navigate that and understand that. I was struggling with the tools, trying to figure out, well, how do I do this? How do I chat? How do I interact? And that created this kind of overhead of awkwardness, so to speak, which was actually interesting too. So there's the social context of the use of these tools, fluency with the tools themselves, and then the affordances, the cues that we may need to read with each other so we know when some kind of interaction is appropriate or not. So all of that stuff is also, I think, very interesting as well in the context of XOR, and we don't really know what the lay of the land is like yet for these things. And I'm reminded, I guess, of the comment, as we build our tools, we shape our tools, and then the tools shape us. I think that's also something that's worth considering when we look at these things. Okay, for some more context of why we're doing all this stuff, I think working together, designing, building together in these environments there's huge potential for these things. I'm also really interested in the idea of somebody who has particular limitations with their senses in some ways that could be augmented in the context of XOR, to be able to allow them to interact and work in ways which they wouldn't be able to do in their lives without these technologies, and that's something that's quite exciting here. So XOR would have the potential to augment a user's sight, or to augment a user's ability to be able to interact and perform fine motor controls, in the context of using some kind of switch input devices, or some kind of touch pads which have various macros applied, used in conjunction with sophisticated scanning applications within XOR environments. So all of this kind of stuff is potentially really, really exciting, and I think there's great opportunities here for people with disabilities who could do jobs that they would not be able to do at all in their lives without these kind of assistive technologies. So there's great potential within XOR to actually have sophisticated new technologies. So what are the new technologies within an XOR environment that could allow a user to perform a task that they would not be able to do in their lives without these technologies, and perform some kind of job, perform some kind of build things, imagine things, create things. You make wonderful music, yeah, all of these things. So all of that's really, really exciting to me, and I think the promise of XOR is this. Okay, whoops. Okay, so a couple of practical things, okay, before we go to some of the work, some of the research I'm doing in W3C into these things. So imagine being able to use a range of input devices and multiple devices for output. Now that might sound not particularly very exciting, but actually it is, because someone with a disability, depending on what it is, it could be cerebral palsy, it could be a combination of various different user needs. They may use different input devices. So we have the traditional model of the keyboard and the mouse. As we know, a blind user can't use a mouse. Someone with limited mobility may have difficulty using a keyboard. They may need a combination of switches. For those who don't know, a switch is basically often like a binary input-output device, like a light switch on-off. But it can be used in conjunction with quite sophisticated scanning applications to be able to trigger macros using time selection of row and horizontal and vertical content. Anyway, the point is, a user could have a range of input devices that they need. They could also have a range of output devices that they need. For example, a blind user may have multiple sound cards within their setup, where they have maybe 1, 2 screen readers, 3 different output devices being fed by the being fed basically. So you could have a Braille output device in conjunction with a couple of sound cards, and you could route different kinds of audio to different outputs depending on what it is. So potentially within a kind of a chat type application, you could be watching a media within an XOR type environment, consuming media through one type of sound card, and then also you could have sophisticated audio routing. So the user could be able to actually hear alerts or text messages through another kind of sound card, or output that through Braille, and use a combination of those things within an XOR type chat situation. So XOR has got potential for quite sophisticated input and quite sophisticated output options and possibilities. Now, this brings up quite thorny questions about how all that will be managed. So, for example, would it be managed on an operating system level? Would it be managed within the XOR environment itself? Would there be some middleware, some kind of bridging technology between the operating system and the XOR environment? What would those bridging spaces look like? What would those APIs look like? And what would be the Uber architecture that would manage all of those things? Because one of the things we find is there's potential for a lot of complexity here within XOR and the managing of these input and output devices. And rather like, I guess, a conductor in an orchestra, there's potentially there's a need for something to manage those input and output devices for the user, so that they can be routed in a way the user needs, so that they can be configured in a way the user needs. And also within an XOR environment, that might change depending on context. So, for example, you may have a user in one particular state within an XOR environment where they need to use setup X with input devices configured in one particular way, output devices configured in another way. But then when they change, they move into another space or go to some other task, those input and output configurations may need to also change in terms of context. Okay, so this brings up my last point about why we're doing all this stuff. So the environment can learn and change and adapt as the user needs, as the user requires, which is potentially very exciting and very interesting. The whole issue of customization, personalization within XOR is really, really prescient and very exciting. So the idea of being able to personalize and customize your environment is something that's very relevant in XOR and totally possible. Okay, so I've kind of mixed up. That was my pitch for why we're doing this stuff. When I was really thinking about, well, why are we doing this stuff? So I was trying to figure out, some of from my own perspective, some of the main points, the raison d'etre for these things. What are the challenges? Touched on some of those things in my talk already, and I guess we can talk a little bit more about what some of those challenges are. So from the perspective of the user, there's a particular set. From the perspective of the designer and the developer, there's a particular set. So we'll just go through some in a broad sense of what I see what some of those particular challenges are. So first of all, from the user perspective, the way I see it is to be able to use your assistive technology with a range of complex input devices. Now that hides a multitude of sins, so to speak, because there's a whole range of issues within there, because really that's covering everything from managing the actual input devices themselves to actually inputs bubbling through various accessibility APIs into an XOR environment or through some operating system level interaction. So that in itself is an incredibly complex and interesting area. How will it work? How will assistive technology potentially change in the context of XOR? Well, we're used to, for example, a model where a user generally brings their assistive technology to the table, what they need. They have pretty much a custom setup a lot of the time with their own requirements. But the XOR environment could potentially provide the assistive technology. This is another thing too. Now that's obviously way off, but it's certainly something that could well happen. So there's a question now, I guess, before we get to any shiny, happy future type thing. But there is a question now of legacy user agents. How will that work with older assistive technology? And certainly I would be very concerned that users of older assistive technologies aren't blocked out of these kind of things. So there's a kind of baseline level which we would want to make sure is maintained, and that there's a high degree of interoperability between older types of assistive technology and any new shiny thing that comes out too. So how will all of those things be coordinated? So that's a challenge for the user as well as the technical side of it. Actually, just for context, just to be accurate, it is a challenge for the user because from a user perspective, how will they manage the different kinds of inputs that may be needed to be able to do a particular task within XOR as well? So that's something. Okay, from a user perspective, I guess in the context of the physical interaction or the precision or timing or accuracy that may be needed, some tasks may need a high degree of precision. So we are aware of, and certainly they exist, different types of assistive technologies that can be used to augment a user's ability and provide a buffer between if, the user and the task, or the user and the object. So someone may have a tremor, they may have spasms, they may have involuntary movement, and the assistive technology may need to, like sticky keys, and I guess there's a sticky keys type abstraction in an XOR environment that can mediate between particular users' needs, and augment that also. There could be issues with timing. Time is a very interesting thing in the context of XOR, particularly because it can be considered to some degree fluid. Obviously, time is we can consider it in a basic sense linear, but within the context of XOR, there is the capacity or the potential to be able to scrub time and go backwards and forwards in time, to be able to modify time in a way where a user can slow down the time frame needed to perform a particular task, can potentially reverse a task, so on and so forth. Accuracy is also important. So it's also important, maybe important, a particular level of accuracy, various different kinds of assistive technology or middleware or mini applications within an XOR could be used to help help a user perform a particular task. On another level, in terms of for a user, say a blind user, someone who's non-sighted, there may be objects that they won't know what they are. They won't be described particularly well, or they may not have semantic description. You can consider it labeling from the 2D web space. You can consider it role states and properties from the ARIA type space. So all of those kind of things are similar paths to what may be needed in XOR in order to be able to describe objects in that space. And something that interesting that we've been looking at is the idea. I'm quite interested in the idea of an object-oriented architecture for XOR. Something we kind of looked at, and it's kind of, I suppose, a little bit of a personal thing. I think it might be a good idea that we look at it, not develop that, not developed it particularly far at the moment, but have been thinking about it. So the context, what I'm talking about, is that any particular object, any particular thing has particular attributes, properties, so on and so forth. Those things maybe have particular behaviors. You could think of it in a similar way to, I guess, physical modeling engines within 3D environments. I'm not a gamer anymore, but those kind of things could be thought of as being similar. Okay, so another perspective is that another user challenge is captioning, for example, in the context of captions in XOR. This is quite interesting, and there's work going on in the immersive captioning community group at W3C and in other spaces in working out what captioning needs to be like in XOR. There are interesting issues with this. I mean, simple things like, for example, the caption being related to its source, and then if the context of the field of view changes, that source will be maintained. There are also color contrast issues with captions, potentially issues with resizing, re-rendering of captions to preserve legibility, all of those kind of things. So access to all of these things is I guess, a user and both a user and a technical challenge. Okay, so we've talked a good bit about input and output device routing. I think made that point pretty clear again, and I think that's a real very interesting area. Another interesting area is that interaction and affordances in the context of XOR may not always be obvious. So what do I mean by that is that, you know, how a user would use something and any affordances something may have. So affordances are I guess the intuitive knowledge you have of how to use something that is transmitted through the thing itself. I mean, for example, with a pair of scissors, you know, if has particular affordances that when you pick it up, you pretty much instantaneously know how to use it. So how do we make those kind of affordances apparent within XOR, and how do we make interactions more fluid? And I guess one of the things that actually interests me in this space, even aside from the technical aspects of these interactions, as I say, are as I say, the simple things like the social cues, the social aspects of these things. Because how and when to do something may not be obvious. And there's also, on the flip side, is this the potential unintended consequences of those things not being obvious as well, which is worth considering. Finally, personalization and customization of environments to meet a particular user need is also a challenge, and this may also be dynamic and context dependent. I touched on that earlier. So I touched on that earlier when I was saying that what a user needs at one particular time in one particular context may change depending on what happens. So that could be routing changes within the environment, or it could be the need for some kind of modality to be augmented within XOR. Okay, so what are the technical challenges from XOR accessibility? So we've talked about various different aspects of user challenges, various aspects of technical challenges. These aren't as cut and dried maybe as they could have been in the presentation, but that's okay. There's a back and forth. We are working in W3C on looking at identifying gaps in current standards for accessibility, for example. There are a lot of challenges which we'll touch on. One of the things I think that's interesting, particularly from perspective of an agile viewpoint, is what does good look like in this space? So where do we want to be? I think that isn't always as clear as it could be, but that's something that's being worked out broadly by the community, I think, as well, and something that requires a lot of intense collaboration from various different diverse viewpoints and various different diverse perspectives. In terms of a technical architecture for XOR, I think that's something that should be. I suppose I'm cautious to use the word generic, but it probably gets across my idea. I don't know if it should be a bespoke architecture for XOR that here, like here's the main platform over here that serves this purpose or that purpose, and then we have the accessibility bit that's for the accessibility bit. I wonder if these things should be really put together in a very cohesive way so that it's just a part of the system. Part of the accessibility should be a part of the definition of done. I was mentioning agile, so I think that is something that's worth considering, that we embed these things within the generic platform, generic architecture, and accessibility is just there as a part of the stack from the get-go. There's a URI there called Web XOR Standards Accessibility Architecture Issues, and I will share some of those after the call. This is just some of our thoughts, and also maybe an interesting primer or background reading on XOR accessibility. So semantics. So some of the technical challenges come down to semantics. What does it all mean? So how do we describe stuff? What's its purpose? Role states and properties, so on and so forth. Rinse and repeat. Really, this is a very common thing in accessibility. All accessibility people here are very familiar with the importance of this kind of thing. Something that I've been thinking about is a modular approach to semantics as they relate to immersive environments. And what I mean by that is that these things could be potentially broken down into various different objects. I was thinking really kind of like in the sense of like primitives, really, that have various properties that could be used and reused, and those properties themselves would do things within the XOR environment. Again, rather like a physics kind of engine. Anyway, movement, interaction, accessibility, all of that kind of stuff. So we wrote up some of that stuff in an XOR semantics model. Some of these things are on literally in a wiki state, and so they really are works in progress. But we are actively thinking about this stuff. What do we not want? We don't want token accessibility. This is something that's very, very important. It's something that we come across in the wild. So there's a screenshot here of a ramp coming up a bunch of stairs, and it would be very useful for a wheelchair user, very useful for a mother pushing a buggy, a pram, very useful for someone with shopping trolley, but it also stops before it gets to the top, and then the stairs kick in again. This kind of thing is planning gone mad, but we really do come across this kind of thing a lot, and it betrays a lack of understanding, first of all, of what need is trying to be met by any particular thing, a lack of kind of due diligence, and also the desire to potentially just tick a box and say, well, look, we've dealt with accessibility, we've a half-built ramp that should be useful for somebody, but it absolutely isn't. And another picture here of a whole load of crisps, potato chips, Doritos or whatnot, in a vending machine with Braille, very useful Braille, but it's all behind glass. So it looks great, makes it look like the vendor cares about accessibility, but it's not much use to anybody. That's what we don't want. Also, special thanks to John Folio, my colleague, W3C, for this. John provided some of these photos. I think these are really, really good examples, and we come across this kind of thing all along. The last one is, just to describe it, a bunch of buttons in a lift which say push to lock door when lit, with nice Braille underneath it and whatnot. Push to close door when lit, push to open door when lit, but which light is lit is anybody's guess. Okay, what are we doing about all of this at W3C? I want to just finally introduce you to some of the work and the research that we're doing just in the last few minutes, and then hopefully answer some questions if there are any questions, I guess, if we're doing that. So, great. We are working on the XOR accessibility user requirements. So this is what we call XAUR, XAUR. So to address these challenges and to outline these challenges and to point out potential user needs and requirements, we have published a bunch of user requirements which outline many of the challenges that we've talked about, particularly in the context of the user need. The real focus here was, what is the user need? I'm a big fan of user needs. Without them, you can't have appropriate requirements. Without understanding what user needs you're trying to meet, you really are in the dark and coming up with solutions that are, at best half baked, or at worst creating more barriers than the problem that they're trying to fix. So it's very, very important to understand the user need. I think many good accessibility people are very, very good at this. In my experience, they understand what need they're trying to meet. They have experience directly or indirectly of the problem that they're trying to fix, and they understand in a deeper way what the need is and what the potential solution for that need is. And again, as I say, I think many people I've worked with over the years who I really respect are people who understand these things in a deeper way. Many solutions are often quite simple and common sense. So this document lists accessibility user needs and requirements in XOR. It covers navigation aspects, interaction aspects, multimodal affordances, object semantics, and more. I'm going to share the URI with everybody after the call. This is now in a second draft, and we are just, even as I speak, drum roll, even as I speak, this is being minted as a second draft. So we have an editor's draft, which will be out very, very soon. And also, I want to say, actually, just while I can, Many, many thanks to everybody who has contributed to the document. I have to say it was quite successful. We got loads of feedback on GitHub, on our repository, and comments on the APA list to the working group, and really appreciate everyone's feedback, some very, very useful comments. So we've iterated this. The first version was out in February, I think, or March, and we've iterated it now again. So it's coming along really, really well. So what we wanted to do is identify where pain points were, and where there were gaps. Again, all of this with the view to work out what good looks like. We can learn a lot, I think, also from gaming. They taking accessibility very, very seriously. Just for some context, I was at the London Gaming Conference, and the gig Ian Hamilton runs, and he's doing really, really good work with Gareth from the BBC, and Jamie Knight was there, and a lot of really interesting perspectives from people in the context of gaming. I think I was very impressed myself, just in terms of there was a lot of cash money being spent, and there's employment opportunities for people with disabilities in gaming, which I was really, really happy to see. Really happy to see the quality as well of many of the alternative type content, shall we say, or I mean things like the quality of audio description or captioning, all of those kind of things within the context of the games. We saw one or two things which were really quite brilliantly done, to a very, very high quality, where these things were integrated within the game very, very well. It wasn't like some, second-class citizen or some, poor overlay, which looks kind of really crappy and is stuck over because someone hit some preference. And when they started the game, it was really integrated in a very good way. And I think that kind of thing is needed. Okay, so finally, just to say, we need a very broad engagement in XOR standards development. And if you're interested in contributing, please do get involved. W3C is a very meritocratic organization. If you've got good ideas and you make sense, you'll be heard. Okay, some takeaways from all of this. So finally, just to consider the importance of semantics, role states, and properties. All the stuff that we learned in the context of 2D is all still applicable in the context of XOR. The first thing, we need to secondly support various input and output devices, as from the developer side and also from the vendor side, from the people who are building these things, who are creating APIs as well. All of these things need to be done. We need to allow the customization of these things and potentially the orchestration of these things. So that's multiple diverse inputs being controlled by some kind of central orchestration brain thing. We need to work that out. Support consistent tracking as well, manage critical messaging and alerts. From a design perspective, paying attention to good usability and affordances in XOR is critical. It was critical in 2D web. It's going to be more critical in XOR. Routing to second screens. Second screen is a term that we use in APA for another output device. It may not be a screen. Support subtitling customization, safe harbor controls, time limits in XOR environments as well. I think may be useful for some people too. Magnification, context, orientation, and resetting, particularly for people with low vision. People using kind of screen magnification, very easy to get lost in an XOR type context. So to be able to reorientate yourself, reset a field of view is also something that is very, very interesting in XOR. I mean, it's very common within 2D web for someone using screen magnifier to get lost within a page, for example, particularly if there's a lot of, say, white space. In XOR, that's potentially much worse and much more disorientation too. So I think this is something that would be very important. So I guess I'm going to be wrapping up soon. If there are any questions or something like that, maybe we could go to those. I'm not too sure how this is going to work just at the end, but just a heads up to Adrian that I'll be finishing up my presentation now in the next couple of minutes. Briefly, just at the end, I want to just talk about some of the other emerging technologies that I'm working on, that we're working on in APA, the Web Accessibility Initiative. We're looking currently at issues of privacy and security. And in the context of accessibility, those things are often muxed together, but they are two quite different things. So the considerations of accessibility and privacy are different, considerations of security and accessibility are different, but that's also a very interesting area. I'm also looking at user needs for machine learning, artificial intelligence to some degree, and Web of Things, which is also quite challenging to find and define those, because the layer under Web of Things is often not necessarily obvious, and how it bubbles up into the user interaction aspect isn't always obvious. But there's many interesting aspects of all of these things. And right now, just there's a heads up, there's a very interesting machine learning conference, for example, on in W2C Machine Learning Conference, and I just did a presentation with Lisa Seaman, who runs the Cognitive Accessibility Task Force. She did a very, very interesting presentation on the potential use of machine learning to support the needs of people with cognitive accessibility needs. I think that's really, really interesting. I can share that as well after the presentation. Something else we're working on is map accessibility. There is another workshop coming on Maps for All. Map accessibility also ties with geospatial computing too, and there's potential work here on user needs also in terms of how accessible maps could be developed. So all of these are presenting new challenges and opportunity, and W2C Web Accessibility Initiative is actively working on these spaces now, and we welcome your input into all of these things. Okay, I'm kind of finishing up now, so thank you very much. I hope it was engaging. I hope I didn't ramble too much. I've been up with a puppy for the last 3 nights, a little beagle puppy, and I am pretty knackered, but there you go. Thomas.
Great. Well, Josh, thanks so much for your presentation. Also, thank you for the mention of attending my meetup, and I'm sorry about getting lost out in the water. That sounds scary. We're gonna have to work. No one should ever be lost out in the water.
It was informative, and it was an eye opener, and it was interesting. So don't feel too bad.
Yeah. So we really appreciate your talk today. Thank you for the information. We have collected some of the links that you mentioned about the different standards, wiki pages, and work that you're doing that we will share out on social media and into the YouTube video itself. Unfortunately, we're out of time for questions. So we do have some questions that we received that we will send to you via email.
Great.
Really appreciate everything you did today. So thank you so much. And thank you for coming to ID24. For those of you guys here subscribed or watching, let's make sure that if you like this session, make sure you hit that YouTube like button. So you know how social media likes you to do the push notification of telling people that you enjoyed something. You can also subscribe on youtube.com/inclusivedesign24, and that's how you'll find out about other events related to this conference. You can also see all of the previous presentations from all the different years that this event has gone on. So there's a huge wealth of knowledge there, and we appreciate everyone coming today to this presentation on XR accessibility. We want to give a reminder that Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to Barclay Access, Adobe, Intopia, Tetralogical, Intuit, Webbable, DQ Systems, Adrian Roselli LLC, and finally, InfoAxia, Makoto Ueki from Japan, which is also where I'm based, will be your next event host, and his company is also one of the sponsors for this event. So thank you all for coming today, and we'll be back on the top of the next hour to start our next session. We'll see you then.